Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. My name is Jen Park, and I'm the Community Engagement and Talent Development Specialist at Ramapo Catskill Library System. This session is being recorded, and the recording will live on the Virtual Professional Development LibGuide, and I'll place a link to that in the chat. Within the next few days, you will receive a follow-up email with an online feedback form, if you could take a few minutes to fill that out. In addition to the form in that email, there will be a link to the presentation, so you can go ahead and visit that link. If you have any questions during today's program, or if you find you're having any sort of technology issues, please direct message me, or you can email me. Or you can call me. So I will be accessible. I will be monitoring all aspects of communication, so you can get in touch with me. So today's program, first of all, thank you so much to Ron Kursop for leading today's program. This was actually someone from our member library sent an email to me and said, I heard this was great. Can we invite Ron to present? I said, let's give it a shot, right? So thank you so much, Ron, for being here. So Ron served 42 small and rural public libraries in Western New York as the executive director of the Pioneer Library System. Ron received his project management professional certification in May of 2019 from the Project Management Institute. He mainly focuses on implementing successful projects, team building, productivity, and trustee education. And so with that, I am going to say welcome and thank you to Ron. I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to him.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate it. So hopefully everyone can see my screen, and what I have there, if you take a look under my name there, is it's a bit.ly link, and where that will take you is to a Google Drive folder where I've put together some resources for you. I always like to do this when I have presentations. You'll see the first one on the list is this collaborative notes. I've linked a bunch of resources and stuff like that in here, and also as you're watching today, you are welcome to take some notes if you'd like here. The whole group can start typing in there. That's fine. I don't usually have people take me up on this, so if you would like to add some notes there, please do so. This will stay available. I also have planning a project module worksheets in Word and PDF, and then I have a spreadsheet of some project charter stuff, and then the slide deck is in here as well. And I'll make sure Jen gets this so so she can send it out a little bit later too. But today what we're going to do is we're going to start by talking about project management. And to me, this is a pretty important topic, mainly because when we talk about doing anything, usually it's some type or some form of project that we have to implement in order to get a desired result out of it. So when we go through project management, one of the big things that people always ask me is, Ron, what is a project management professional certification? Do I need one to do a project? And what's involved with getting it? The PMP is the Project Management Professional Certification, and you can study up and take a test through the Project Management Institute to receive it. And what this certification is it allows you to, one, have a higher job opportunity in project management fields, if you're interested in that, and two, it gives you the structure of a formal structure of how projects are actually completed by a project manager. A few reasons that I got this. One, because I think that in libraries, basically everything we work on is either an operation or a project. I'll get into the differences between the two. And also, I work a lot with the New York State construction grants, so that means I'm talking with architects all the time, and I'm talking to contractors all the time. And they have a certain set of language that they use, because oftentimes they'll have a certified project management or a project management office that is working with their field. So just understanding the language, I think, is worth it. You don't need a PMP certification to run projects. You can certainly just the items that I'm going to go through today are going to talk about the 5 general processes that you go through in order to complete a project. but you don't need a certificate to claim that you're working on projects. In order to get the certification, you need to have a 3,500 hours of project management experience over a 5-year period, and you need 35 hours of project management education, and you need the application process to receive your PMP is pretty involved because you have to document each one of those projects. Now, just because it wasn't formally called a project when you were doing it doesn't mean it doesn't count. So if you're interested in this type of certification or you've thought about it before, give me a call. I'm happy to talk to you about it. In order to receive it, you take a test after the application process. It's a 200-question test, and it was probably the most difficult studying and testing situation that I've ever been in. It was interesting how in-depth the Project Management Institute is, because if I ask you what project management is, you'll be able to rattle off something, right? But the thing with PMP is that it gets really into the nitty-gritty stuff, and there's a lot of nuances that, I mean, even I still don't care about, even though I have the certification. But it's just it's interesting how vast the body of knowledge is for project management. But I'm not going to get too deep into that today. Mainly what I'm going to talk about are the 5 processes. So when it comes to project management, you have 12 knowledge areas, 5 process groups, and 49 processes. So within these, I think the most important conversation that we can have today is talking about those process groups. Now, this is kind of a flow chart of what project management actually looks like. You can't read this because I had to shrink it down so much to fit it on the screen. Don't worry about it. This is just to give you an idea of all the different pieces and the way that projects flow and the complexities that go into it. So if you are going into project management, whether it's the field or you're just managing your own projects, just remember to give it the respect that it deserves. Usually when people talk to me about things that they've tried to implement that have failed, it's because one of the 5 process groups fell apart somewhere along the way. And I'm hopefully, once we talk about them today, you'll have a better idea of what of how to correct that type of thing. So we're going to be talking about the 5 process groups: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. So if you have even just a general understanding of these 5 and you apply them to the work that you're doing, I guarantee that things will level up a bit. You may already be doing these 5 things and maybe you just didn't know it, or you don't call them this. Maybe you call them something else. That's great too. But these are the areas that we're going to be talking about today. And as Jen said at the top, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in chat. I'm happy to answer as we're going through this. And if you have anything, just let me know. But let's start out by talking about the difference between projects versus operations. So when I'm talking about a project, I'm referring to any type of specific thing that you are doing that you will create a service or a product or something at the end of it, and there's a clear start, middle, and end point to it. An operation are those ongoing routine activities that you do. So payroll is an operation. Implementing a new payroll software is a project. So you have a starting point, you are in the middle of it, and then you're able to close it out, and then you have a product that you're working on. So these are the main differences. Operations can't be projects, those ongoing things that continuously happen. But there is a point where some people call something an operation that could actually be a project. If you think about in your libraries, if you have a programmer of some kind, so maybe somebody is doing children's programming, and you might look at that and say, well, that's an ongoing routine activity that involves the organization's primary business. Sure, we as a library do programs, but your planning and execution of those programs could be considered a project. Maybe you take this information we're talking about today and you start and you say, okay, from January 1st to July 1st, here is the set of programs that we have. Here's how we're going to implement them. Here's how we're going to plan them. Right there is a project plan for you. So this seeming operation that you had actually becomes a full-fledged project too, which means you can manage it in different ways. So as we're going through this, even though there is a difference between a project and an operation, sometimes you can move them from column to column depending what they are. It's more of the attributes that make it a project or an operation. When you get into project management, you're always going to hear people talking about different project management approaches. So waterfall is a really popular approach. This is when you go through several phases until you finally get a project at the end. You may have heard people talk about agile. This is when you work a little bit and then you check it to see if it matches the criteria. You work a little bit more, you check it to see if it works on the criteria. Usually construction projects are more waterfall approach, and then software projects are a more agile approach. A lot of people say waterfall is outdated. I don't necessarily think that's true. It's the tool that you use, and that is that's what determines the usefulness of these different methods. So if you are working on something and a design test implementation is the best way to do it, you implement waterfall. If doing different iterations of it is the best way to do it, that's when you look at agile. But as you're talking about project management, people will say a variety of different things out here of these two, as well as others, and say, agile is better, waterfall is better. It's really the tool that fits the job is the best thing to operate on. If people are complaining about a certain project management style, most likely they just haven't been trained in how to implement it, which is fine because every project management style will work with different types of projects, and that's okay. When we're talking about projects, and you would probably agree with this, I hope, most of the time when we deal with anything, we have a few constraints. And in project management, we have the triple constraints. And this is scope, schedule, and budget. So scope, just to define that a little bit for you right now, we'll talk about that more later, is just what you're going to do for the project and what your capacity is. Schedule is your timeline, and then budget is obviously how much money you have. Budget could also mean how much time you have to do it as well. So you have a schedule where you have to implement, but your time budget could be you only have X number of staff hours. And if one of these things is out of alignment, then the other portions of your project are going to suffer from it. So if you don't have enough money, you're going to either have to crash or fast track to get back on schedule. If scope creep starts to set in, then your schedule and your budget are going to have problems. So as you're thinking and planning about projects, these are the three things you should keep in mind. What is the project? That's scope. Schedule, how long do you have to do it? And how much money or time constraints do we have when we're talking about it? The first of the 5 process groups that we're going to talk about is initiating. And this is actually before you even start anything to do with the project. This is kind of like a thinking phase. And at the top, I said most of the time when I hear about projects that have failed, it's usually because one portion of the process groups kind of fell through. This and the last one, closing, are oftentimes the reasons that projects fail. So initiating a project is actually taking the time to sit down and actually sketch out what you're doing. We miss this because a lot of times we'll be sitting in a board meeting, or we'll be sitting in a staff meeting, or we'll just come up with an idea and we'll say, this sounds cool, okay, great, let's do it, without actually thinking about all the implications of putting that into play effectively. So this portion of it, when you get an idea, slow down with the initiating part, and this is actually getting everything in order so you can move forward with it successfully. And the first part of initiation is having a project charter. You may have heard of this before. This is usually some type of short document that gives a description of the project, the whole project, and it has the objectives, how it's going to be carried out, who the stakeholders are. This is the kind of the critical ingredient for making sure that your project actually becomes what you want it to be through the life cycle of the entire project. Project charter, you want to think of it like a recipe. So in the background of this slide, you see chocolate chip cookies, right? So this is essentially a project charter. It says the ingredients, bake time 8 to 10 minutes, so you have your time constraints on there. You would be able to add up the price of all of these items to get your budget involved with it too. So your project charter, it's just a recipe for whatever your end goal is going to be. So it includes what it is, how much it's going to cost, and what the schedule is for when you need to have it, when you need to have it executed by or validated. And in that link that I had in the top that'll be sent out too, there was some examples of what a potential project charter could look like. If you Google project charter, there's going to be a whole mess of different types of samples that you can use. Keep in mind, I'm going to be talking about a lot of documents that you can produce through this presentation. And when I say produce a project charter, or when I'm talking about a budget or a scope document or whatever, it doesn't have to be like a multi-page document. You can just have it as a paragraph. As long as you thought about it and you get the main objectives like this recipe right here, that's fine. It doesn't have to be 3 or 4 pages of a project charter. That can sometimes get in the way of what you are actually trying to do. Right now, in order to reopen in the state of COVID, we need to have New York Forward requires us to have some type of reopening plan. That's essentially a project charter. It is going to tell us what we can do, our timeline for doing it, all the implications that are going to happen as we put it into place. So as you're creating those, thinking about it, getting through that initiation point of it, it doesn't have to be a huge document. It just needs to hit all the points that needs to be hit. Okay? So it doesn't have to be complex. If you talk to a project manager, they're going to make it complex because that's what they do. But most of the time, you don't need some in-depth project charter document. Stakeholders, you've heard this a ton of times, I'm sure. Stakeholders are the people who have any type of vested interest in your project. This is a nifty little chart that they give you when you're working on your PMP, and it talks about how you can work with stakeholders during the initiation phase so you have a better understanding of how you should treat them through the life of the project. So this looks at 2 things, the level of power and the level of interest. So let's take, if you're a library director and you have a project you want to implement and your library board is a stakeholder in this, let's say they have a high level of power because maybe it is a large expenditure, so they have to approve that expenditure, but they're not super interested in the project. What you want to do is they would fall in this keep satisfied category. So you want to make sure that they have the information they need and that they are involved in the decision making to a certain extent, but you don't necessarily have to manage them as closely as if you were to have maybe you are a staff person at a library and your library director is the stakeholder in this case. And they have a high level of power and a high level of interest, but you're the one that's actually executing the process. They would fall in this manage closely category. And if you map this out and you think about it a bit, it helps you design a communication plan for the people that are going to be involved in this project. So if you have people who you need to keep informed, so a high level of interest, they don't have any power at all, so maybe this is the staff members, frontline staff, they don't have any input on a specific programmatic project, but they're very interested in it. Keep them informed. So have create a communication plan that allows them to know everything that's going on with it, but you don't have to necessarily have them involved in each decision point. So this exercise just helps you think through who are the people who are interested in this project and how should I treat them through this, because nothing's worse than having somebody with a high level of power, a high level of interest, and you just ignore them through the entire project, because once you get to the end of that project, they may throw a hurdle in the way because they haven't been communicated to or they haven't been involved, or maybe it's going in a way that they didn't originally expect. So without managing them closely, you're not going to get into that position. So just taking a second and thinking about this, the initiation part is all about thinking. So think about everything that you are looking to do and that you're working on. The next thing you want to think about in initiation is the requirements. So in order to check the boxes and say this project is complete, what are the requirements that it needs to meet? So as you go through your project, you have an idea, and then people may be brainstorming and coming up with a bunch of different ideas and adding to it. And really good projects can be a no-go because there's so much stuff added to it, and you don't want to make people feel bad because you don't include their idea, or they wanted so-and-so to work on it, but you know they don't have the time or the expertise to be able to do it. So this little chart can help out quite a bit. I've actually done this with staff before too, where I've put this on the whiteboard and used post-it notes on it. And as we're talking about something, we talk about how hard is this going to be and how important is it to the actual project we're trying to do. If it's really hard and it's not if it's really hard and it's not important, it's probably a no-go. And we're going to say that this isn't something that we're going to do. If it's easy and it's important, it's a go. The negotiation piece is just kind of trying to wiggle it out in which area is it a no or a no-go in terms of how hard is it versus how important it is. So as you start ideas and you have projects that you want to work on, people pile on ideas, think about how hard is it going to be to include this in what I wanted to do, and how important is it? How much does it relate to the project that I want to do? So thinking about this can help you get to your end result a little bit easier. That was initiation. So that was just, I have a project idea. Let's think about the people involved. Let's think about the requirements that we have. Let's think about how hard or easy it's going to be to do these requirements and whether we are actually going to include them or not. And we put together that recipe, that project charter that's going to help us. All right. So that was all the thinking. And then we actually start doing the planning. So that was just solidifying our idea of this is the actual project that we want to create. Now we're going to plan it out and how we're going to actually execute it. So once we enter the planning stage, this is where we're actually going to define the project scope. So this is a list of specific project goals, deliverables, features, function, tasks, deadlines, and ultimately costs. In other words, it's what needs to be achieved and the work that must be done to deliver the project. So your project charter is kind of a light little recipe for stuff as you're thinking about what's going to be included and not included. Once you get to the planning stage and you design that scope, this is what we are going to do and nothing else. I'm going to talk about scope creep a little bit later and some gold plating and stuff like that, but the main reason that you want a project scope is to avoid creating something that you didn't originally intend to create. So you want to spell it out. Now, throughout the life of the project, it doesn't mean that the scope might not change a little bit, but it has to be changed in a way that makes sense to everybody. And if you are working on projects and you get to, and oftentimes you get to a point where you are changing the scope or you're changing the intent of the project and things like that, what it means is that you have failed in the initiation and planning stages of it because it wasn't fully thought out before you started the execution phase of it. So these are just to prevent those changes later on. There's always going to be stuff that you don't know, and there's always going to be risks involved that are going to pop up later that you weren't prepared for. But when you're thinking about a project, trying to get a good picture of everything that's going to happen is going to help you out in the long run. The project scope, this is your specific goals or what you're going to deliver. Project scope's just a checklist. I like checklists mainly because when you get to the end, when you're validating a project, you can go through and it's really easy to check it off. So we designed this specific program, check. We had these community members attend, check, that's great. And everything that we wanted to have in the scope was done, so you can check it off and you're done, and then you can move on to your next project. Your project scope should have your project purpose. So why are you doing this? If you can't give a good reason on why you are doing a specific project, if it doesn't fit within your mission, your goals, your objectives, your strategic plan, your budget, whatever, then maybe it's not something that you should be focusing on. Your goals and objectives, so this supports your purpose. So the purpose is we want to do X, Y, Z. This is how we're going to do it, our goals and objectives. Our acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria is when does this actually make sense? So if our project was to implement a new payroll software, our acceptance criteria is to have the payroll software implemented, all staff are now part of it, and it's accessible remotely. So maybe that's the acceptance criteria when it's finally done. The deliverables, so this is actually the product or whatever that you're handing to whoever wanted the project in the first place. Exclusions. So I mentioned in the beginning that you do that no go exercise. Sometimes it can be helpful to have it in your project scope, the things that you aren't going to do. So maybe you have one trustee that's bent on getting this specific aspect involved, but it's their own personal agenda. It has nothing to do with the project. You have a conversation with them and you say, this specifically isn't going to work with this project. Maybe it could be in a different project in the future. Have an exclusions list where you add that item there, so when you get to the end of the project, nobody's expecting that to be in there. And also, as you're going through, and maybe this one board member really wanted this aspect added to the project, but you as a director, you had the conversation and you're not going to do it, but then that person talks to somebody involved with the project and then it gets added in a kind of a side way, right? So to avoid that in your project scope, having an exclusions list helps out quite a bit, because you can say, no, we decided we're not doing this specific thing because it doesn't fit in with the scope of our project. Constraints, those are all the things that are going to cause problems. So maybe you don't have a lot of money for it, maybe you don't have a lot of time for it. So those are the things that are going to constrain you. So you want to have a list. So if you have a budget of $100 for this project, but you have a little bit of wiggle room with that, you can list out a constraint budget up to 110 max dollars, and if it busts that, then the project has failed. You can also have time constraints. So if it's something where you have a community event coming up in August, you have that your drop dead date as mid-July, and if it's not done by that time, the project has failed. It's okay to put those constraints and failure criteria in there. So if you get to that point, those deadlines, and your project doesn't actually work out, it's clearly stated in here. And this helps with staff, because if you say, staff, if you could have this done by such and such a date, and then they don't have it done, they may not know the implications or the results of not having it done by that date. So having those constraints listed in your project scope can help out a lot. And then assumptions, so all the things we assume. In this month, I think assumptions are really hard to make. Back in March, if I was starting a project, I would not have assumed that we would have all been working from home for an extended period of time. So you do the best you can with assumptions. These are just the things that we think. So we assume that by the time we implement this construction project next year, the cost of steel will go up X%. So we're going to have a contingency budget of this. So the assumptions are just things we think are going to happen, but they may not always happen that way. Another little fun PMP thing is a work breakdown structure. So as you're thinking about all these things that are included in your project scope, you can create a work breakdown structure. And if you've ever read the book Eat That Frog by Brian Tracy, he talks a lot about, there's two components of that book. The first one is, if you had to eat a frog, when would you want to do it during the day? And the idea is that, do you want to dread it all day and eat it at the end of the day, or do you just want to get it out of the way in the morning and be done with it and then be on with your day? The other part is, would you take this frog and just shove the whole thing in your mouth, or are you going to cut it up, saute it a little bit, season it, make this frog taste a little bit better, right? So that second part is what a work breakdown structure is. So at the top, you can see number one is project. If you have this project looming over you with all these different components involved with it, and you have just project one on your checklist of whatever this is, it's going to be difficult to check that off because there's so many components to it. So creating a work breakdown structure is essentially just chunking up that project and what you actually have to do. So if we're making a program schedule for the first half of the year, maybe the first quarter of the year, on our checklist, we don't have just create program schedule. Okay, there's lots of stuff that's involved with that. We have to make sure that we have the budget. We have to get in touch with speakers. We have to make sure the community room is free. We have to post things to the calendar. We have to send out the publication. We have to send out information to the community. We have to book snacks or whatever you have. So there's lots of components to that. So it's not a checklist item. It's a project. So as you break those things out and you list all of those things that you have on your list, it it makes it a lot easier because checking for community room availability is a task. You can check that off a list. So as you have this on here, you can check off all these little boxes, and that adds up to your full project. So if you've ever been stuck with something that just keeps moving from task list to task list, think about it in a way that, is this not a task but a project? How can I break this apart and have a bunch of activities that will actually add up to a project in the end? So if you take a look at this chart, it says broad deliverables are on the top line, and then it breaks down to what is the component of that. So there's 4 component deliverables. So all the things that add up to this broad deliverable, and then these 4 broad deliverables actually turn into a full scope project. So breaking up this stuff can help out quite a bit in terms of your understanding of what the work that actually needs to be done. It helps with scheduling. It's a better understanding of how much things will cost. So using a work breakdown structure is a good idea. You don't have to call it that. You can call it whatever you want. Essentially, this is taking one big project and just cutting it up to the actual work that needs to be done. Gold plating. When we get to scope, I mentioned scope creep. Scope creep and gold plating are the 2 worst things that can happen to your scope within the context of a project. And what gold plating is, and if you're doing your own projects, this may not be a big deal. It's when you have other people do projects. So think about, let's say you have an architect that has an architect firm that has a project manager, and they are renovating your building, and you have $500,000 to renovate this section of your building. And they said, well, we got all this work done, and we actually only spent $450,000. So why don't we go ahead and we'll put this big glass window in all the doors on this level, and that will cover that last $50,000, and we'll use it up. So, but that's outside the original requirements of what you had asked for. So they went ahead and spent excess money to make an aspect of your project better, quote unquote, in their eyes, but it wasn't approved and it wasn't something that you had originally asked for. So gold plating is just the idea that you spend more than you originally anticipated to seemingly improve the project the way it was. Now, and the problem with this is maybe that $50,000 that you had, well, I would guarantee that $50,000 that you had saved because for whatever reason, you probably want to apply to another part of your building, not the doors in the part that you were renovating, because that was never part of the plan. So gold plating is just is when a project manager tries to make something better with excess funds that may be distributed elsewhere. So you just have to watch out for that. You'll get a lot of change orders and stuff like that when you're working with construction firms. Sometimes it makes perfect sense and you have to do it. Make sure you're reviewing all these change orders and you're not paying for something that you could possibly save money on. Okay, so gold plating is just getting something a little bit more than you had expected, but you're still spending the money on it. Scope creep is the other part of it. This is my favorite picture through the whole presentation. If you don't know who Andy Sandberg is, he's hilarious. And this is the only one that I don't actually have rights to use, so don't tell anyone I stole this one from the internet. But the idea of scope creep, what it is we have our project, and originally we defined exactly what we were going to do, and then this is when somebody comes up and says, hey, why don't we add this to the project, and you're already partway through it. Why don't we add this to the project? Why don't we try this? So this is when we have our project, but things keep getting added to it, and what happens with scope creep is generally you're going to go over budget because it's things that weren't originally in the initiation and planning phases. You are going to go over schedule because every time you add work, more people are going to have to do more for it, and you are most likely going to break any other types of constraints that you have. So without a clear scope document or understanding, scope creep can happen. And then this is one thing that happens when you start a project and then it never seems to end. And a lot of times it's because your scope keeps changing because people keep adding to it. Again, it's okay to change your scope, but it has to go through integrated change control, which I'll get to a little bit later. Estimating costs. So when you're talking about any type of project, well, first, Jen, are there any questions that have popped up that you wanted to chime in with?
Nothing has come up in the chat so far. So
Okay,
thank you.
cool. If you do have anything, feel free to throw it in there. Otherwise, we can talk about it at the end too. I know I'm going through this stuff kind of quickly. Luckily, it is being recorded, so you can just watch it over and over again. And also, I don't expect you to remember every piece of this presentation. If you can walk away with just one idea, like maybe you are going to start implementing scope in every project that you do from now on, that's great. I feel like the presentation was a success if you do that. Or maybe when I talk about estimating costs, you'll have a better idea on how to estimate costs. Maybe creating a work breakdown structure for just the tasks that you have is going to be beneficial. All that stuff's great. I don't expect you to have a full understanding of project management. This is kind of just we'll throw everything at the wall, and whatever resonates with you, that'll be fantastic. But when it comes to estimating costs, so everything costs money. And it can sometimes be tough to figure out how much something's going to cost. So I want to do this early literacy program for my community, and I want to have X number of programs, and I want to be able to offer this as a reward or whatever. And the next question is going to be, how much is that going to cost? And you can just kind of have a number off the top of your head, or you can go through estimating procedures that help you kind of get a better idea of what it's going to cost. There's two main estimating procedures. There's analogous estimation and parametric estimation. So analogous is when you take a look at a previous similar project and you kind of extrapolate the costs. So maybe maybe you want to do this project because you saw its success in a library that has already run it. So an analogous estimation would be, hey, library, how much did it cost you to implement this project? And they say, well, X number of dollars. You can say, okay, well, we want to add these couple other features, so we'll take how much they paid for it. This was a year ago, so costs probably went up, so we add a little bit of money to it, and we add how much it's going to cost, and then bam, we have an analogous estimation based on what other people have done. And this architects do this all the time. So they have one project and it costs 100,000, so this project might cost 100,000. Parametric estimation, this comes in, this is when like an architect would say, sorry I keep using construction terms, but I just work a lot with construction. But architects use like that square footage. So if your building is square foot, X number of square feet, it's going to cost this amount of money, and they just put it into a formula, and it's kind of like analogous, but it's a little bit more intense. So this is just more or less a formula that they have, so they know based on 15 previous projects, the average square foot cost is this. So they punch in your square footage, and then you have your parametric estimation. This is one reason why you can't use for the New York State construction grant for libraries, this is one reason that you can't use architects' cost estimates for your project cost. It's because it is parametric. They may call it something different, but essentially it's an estimate based on previous projects, not an estimate based on your actual project that you're doing. So you can get more or less okay stuff by doing these two. Probably the best way to estimate how much a project is going to cost is actually go back to that work breakdown structure. So remember when we had that project and we broke it down into all of our deliverables? Well, we start at the very bottom and we take a look at how much is this going to cost. And then we go up a level. How much is this going to cost? And then we keep going up. And then before you know it, we're at our 4 broad deliverables, or maybe it's a one line project, and that's fine too. But we get to our broad deliverable and we know how much that costs. So then we know how much the project's going to cost. So we're creating a project plan for 6 months. And on the bottom level, we actually have to figure out what we have to agree. We get speaker agreements for this. So let's say we have 4 speakers. There's going to be 4 programs. So these 4 lines here will be our programs. So the bottom line is program 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the speakers for each one, let's say they're going to be $100. So we put $100 on that bottom line, and then we go up To the next one, maybe we have different venues for some. So maybe two of them we're hosting at the library, one we're at the community college, and then one we're actually renting space because we need a large venue. So maybe it's free, but then one of them is maybe $300. And then we go up. Is snacks going to cost? And then that third tier up is going to be snacks. So we're going to say this one is going to be X number of dollars, whatever, whatever, whatever. And then we go up one, and maybe this is advertising. So how much are we going to sink into advertising? And then at the top, you'll know between the speaker fees, the location fees, the advertising fees, and the snacks fees. And then that tells you how much that broad deliverable is going to cost. You add all those together, and then you have your total project cost. So actually starting from the bottom and working your way up can give you a realistic estimate. Now, these are all estimates. You're never going to know how much a project is actually going to cost until the project is done. But if you have an estimate, maybe you put in some contingency budgets in there too, just in case. Maybe we assume that we can have a space, but one of our risks is that the community room may be double booked or something like that. So we need to watch out and make sure that we have money just in case we have to rent a space for it or something like that. But this is a really good way to start from the bottom and work your way up to estimate how much something is going to cost overall. This is a fun little formula that you can learn for project management, and this is another estimation. So maybe you did this bottom-up estimating. So maybe this is $800. So most likely our project is going to cost $800. We would love it if it only cost $600. And the pessimistic is maybe we would break the budget and it would cost $1,000. So you add those three up, you divide it by 3, and you get what's called a beta distribution for the price. Don't worry about this right now. If you are totally geeking out by everything that I said, send me an email and say, Ron, I want to hear more about this beta distribution and how to calculate it, and we can talk about it because it's fun, but maybe not as fun to all of you. There's another way that you can run it too. Don't worry about that one right now. The beautiful thing is this analogous parametric and bottom-up estimating. We were talking about money, but it also applies to time schedules too. It works the same. So you can do a bottom-up estimation on how much time it's going to take. So if we start down at the bottom of our speakers, it's going to take, maybe it takes a while to get speakers. And you estimate it's going to take a week, and then to actually get the room space, you estimate how long it'll take. So you can, whatever that work breakdown structure is that we had, you can have maybe your price on one side and then your time estimates on the other side, so you know how much time it's going to take as well as how much money it's going to cost. Because it's important to know what our schedule is so we know when we can actually complete something. Because if we just say project go, we don't know how much it's going to cost, or we don't know how much time it's going to take, we are most likely going to be over budget, or we're not going to get what we want, and it's going to either run late or not enough is going to be included and it's going to end early. So there's lots of things that you want to think about with those. And this is your project schedule. So the cost is just your project budget. The project schedule, you want to make sure that you define your activities, you know what your team can handle. Don't implement a project if you don't have the staff to handle that project. Vendor constraints, so maybe your staff has all the time in the world, but this vendor can only do it during the month of August or something like that. You want to make sure you understand those. The dependence and the sequence, that's just what needs to happen first, and making sure that if you are renovating your library and the shelving doesn't show up and it is installed before your flooring is done. Okay, so this is just sequencing them out and making sure that it's done. Most of the time, architects and contractors will do that for construction, but you may need to figure it out for your other projects, like your program schedule. You don't want to book the community room and start advertising a program before you talk to the speaker about actually doing it. That can be problematic. It's happened before. You might hear this sometimes, running low on time. There's two ways that you can solve this. Both of them run significant risks. So fast tracking is just doing two or more things at the same time. So we talked about sequence. So if you are delivering the shelving and doing the floors at the same time, you run the risk of problems happening. Crashing is when you add more people to it, which always increases costs. So that can be problematic as well. So if you notice something isn't going well, you could crash the project and you put more staff on it. You'll get to a point where more staff isn't actually helpful, but that's something that the project manager decides. We can talk a bit about quality. The cat has nothing to do with quality. I just like cats. Quality is simply setting goals and taking measurements to make sure the deliverable meets the goals. So we have, well, let's see here. We'll get to it in a second. So quality is just this idea of making sure that you have everything that you need. So quality control is, does this project meet what we want? Usually we think of quality as, is it good or is it not good? But in project management speak, quality is just, if it's high quality, it means it checks all your boxes that was in your project charter and scope documents earlier on. And it conforms to requirements. So whatever is created conforms to requirements. So that that architect firm that said, let's put these glass windows and these doors to spend this extra $50,000, that is not a conformance to requirements, because your requirements were just wooden doors, not glass window doors. Okay, so even though it could be seen as a little bit better, it's actually outside the general scope of your requirements. These are the things you want to have in quality management. So conformance to requirements, customer satisfaction is always a good thing, making sure that the person that's actually receiving it is happy. So this can come into play where if you're planning your program schedules, you can do satisfaction surveys and stuff like that from your patrons to see, is this actually something that you benefited from? And with the minimum standards that go into place January 2021, it asks for periodic evaluation. So this can be part of it. You can include this right in your project plan. Unstated, the common sense things don't need to be included in terms of quality. So things like we installed these doors, they need to open. Okay, that's something that you don't need to necessarily state. And then fitness for use, just making sure it's safe and everything is in there that they need. Quality versus grade. So this is where things come into play a little bit. And usually I would give everybody a little test, but we're kind of, I don't want to keep you over, so I'll tell you. Usually the question that I ask is, if the project was to have a meal, which one of these has a higher quality and which one of these has a higher grade? Now, a lot of people will say, okay, so I'm looking at these two items. The way that I understand quality is A will be a better quality, unless you really love hot dogs, but I mean, come on, who does? But most people would say A has a higher quality, but if you remember, quality is just the conformance to requirements. If the requirements is to eat a meal of some kind, both of them actually fill that requirement. Now, when we're talking about grade in projects, grade is actually how much value we put to it. So B may be a lower grade than A, but they are both the same quality because they fulfill the requirements to the project. So I want to eat something. The quality is that I eat something. Both of these fulfill that requirement. I want to eat something. The grade is how much value we put to it. So I may value A over B. And this is important because when you're talking to project managers, they may hear you say quality, but they may have a different quality in their head. And same when they're talking to you about quality. You could say, I want a high quality thing, but you're actually referring to grade. So the lingo in project management, it's just good to have a little bit of an understanding of it. Quality means something does what you need it to do. Grade describes how much people value it. Okay? Communication plan. It's always important to have some type of communication plan in place. Now remember, we're still in the planning phase. When we're talking about the 49 processes for project management, planning has a majority of the processes in there because they want to make sure that you've planned everything out in advance so you're ready for anything. Communication management is just coming up with a plan on throughout the life cycle of this project, who are you talking to? How often do you need to talk to them? And what do they need to know? So the stakeholders that we talked about at the beginning, that's going to help you create a communication plan of some kind. And it could be staff, we email once a week, board members, we just talk monthly, community, we advertise when we're ready. So it could be something as easy as that, but just knowing who your stakeholders are and when you need to communicate it. A project manager, so this is from the Project Management Body of Knowledge, the PMBOK. 95% of the project manager's time is dedicated to communication. So if you are not a good communicator, it's time to up that a little bit, because that's actually what you need to focus on the most for being able to manage a project successfully. Okay, so communicating things out from a project manager's perspective, this is how people are going to stay in the loop. They're going to feel comfortable with the changes. They're not going to get to the end of the project and say, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. Okay, so you want to make sure you just know how you're going to communicate with people. Risk management. There's risks with everything, and you have a few options when it comes to risks. You can accept a risk and just say it's going to happen, so we'll deal with it. You can avoid the risk and say we're going to do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen. You can transfer the risk, which is essentially buying insurance. So there's a risk that your sprinkler system would burst and flood your whole library. To transfer that risk, because it might happen, you buy insurance. You buy insurance for that. Okay? Mitigating risk is just when you do everything you can to lower the amount of risk, and then risk can also be good things, so you can exploit it as well. So maybe this risk is actually beneficial, so you can say that we may get a donation of $100,000 to help out with this project, so we exploit it. We actually use that funding to help out with it. So when it comes to risk management, there's this whole section on creating risk management plans, but just know that everything has a risk that's associated with it, and knowing how you're going to work with those types of risks is going to be beneficial. Now, all this stuff put together, communication plan, project scope, risk management plan, our schedule plan, our cost estimates, all this stuff put together makes our project management plan. Now, it took me a while to explain all this stuff, but again, it doesn't have to be long. You could have your scope as 2 sentences, because maybe it's a relatively easy project. You could have your cost estimate as just an analogous estimate, because it cost you this much in the past, so we're going to try this. We're going to say our schedule, we just have it set for it. We only have a month for it, so that's what we're going to put. So your whole project management plan might be just a page, and that's okay. Project management isn't creating dense documentation. What it is making sure that you think through everything before you actually implement. Then we finally get to the point where we can do some work. Executing, you're just doing the work, managing the project, supporting your team, responding to risks. Each team goes through stages as they're coming together. Most of you probably have a staff on hand, so you aren't necessarily going to go through these phases, but sometimes when you start a new project, there's the idea of your team comes together, so they form. They're trying to figure each other out. This happens if you have a new person coming on staff too. They're trying to figure each other out. People are going to say all kinds of stuff, and then things will start to normalize, and people start feeling comfortable. They'll start performing at a higher level, and then if it's a project, they actually adjourn, and they're done, and they're released back to their normal workflow. Okay, so if your staff goes through these kind of phases, don't worry, they will continue to go through these phases, and that's fine. It's just the way people work. If you're working on a project, only invite the appropriate team members. I know there's always a bend to let's invite so-and-so or this person or whatever for whatever political reason that people have. Don't do that. Just invite the people that are going to impact the work in a positive way. This is some team management stuff. I'm just going to breeze through this real quick. I do a separate presentation on team management and conflict resolution. If you're ever interested in that, let Jen know. Maybe she'll have me back to talk about that sometime. But establishing ground rules is a good idea when you're working with a team, so everybody's on the same page. Always handling conflict head-on. Conflict happens in every industry, so you want to make sure you take care of it. When you go through the slides, you'll see this Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument. Take a look at this. It's kind of cool. After you're executing your monitoring controlling, this is basically just making sure that the work is getting done that you need to have done, and making sure that anything that needs to be changed goes through change control. So earlier I talked about integrated change control. This is whenever something that needs to change about your project with scope. So maybe the contractor says this material isn't available anymore. So instead of them just going out and buying that material, you would talk about it. And integrated change control is essentially just you talking about it, figuring out who's in charge of making that final approval and saying, yes, this is okay. If it's getting a speaker for your community, maybe they have to cancel on you, so you decide, well, there's this other speaker, so let's just get them. Is that person who's saying that, do they have the authority to do that, or does it need to go through somebody else? So that's just change control, making sure everybody who's involved with the process is up to date on what the change is that you're doing. How you handle change, who makes change decisions, and submit change requests. So you don't want somebody who is high interest but low power in this making critical decisions. You want to make sure it's a clear chain of command. Oftentimes an organizational structure will help with this, but if you have somebody else who's a different project manager than the actual leader of the organization, you want to make sure that you respect that position and allow them to make those types of decisions. Validating scope is just making sure that you get everything checked off. Sometimes you'll be executing and doing stuff, and then you go to monitor and controlling so you can validate. And when you go through and you say, well, this isn't exactly what we were looking for, you make the appropriate changes, you go back to executing, you do the work, and then you come back. So it's just this cycle. It's not just like, here, we're done. It's let's make sure that we have the stuff that we need. This falls into that agile approach I was talking about earlier, where you go out and you say, is this what you were looking for? Yes, great, do some more. Is this what you were looking for? No. All right, let's go back to the drawing board and fix it so we don't get to the end of the project and have a bunch of stuff that we didn't actually intend to create. So executing and monitoring, controlling is just cyclical. You're just going to go back and forth with it for a while. And then the key to a project is closing it. And this is another area that people run into a significant number of problems because they look at it as, okay, we did the work, but then that was great and it was a lot of fun, so they carry it on a little bit and they keep doing like little things or minor tweaks or whatever. If you set up a project, you go through the initiating, the planning, the executing, the monitoring, controlling, make sure you close it out. Say it's done. Okay, and that's okay to do. Sometimes people will say, well, or maybe you go to your board meeting and you say this was a huge success, and they say, great, we'll keep it going. All right, that's fine, but that's a completely separate project. People are going to get project burnout if you don't close something out. So once you deliver that deliverable, and don't forget to close your project. Once you have that deliverable, make sure you have your closing checklist. So we validated scope. That's just saying we checked everything off the list. This is exactly what we set out to create. All the deliverables have been handed off. So we have our program schedule that we wanted to create. Here it is, and we're working on our programs. We filed all the lessons learned, so everything that we learned through this entire process is going to be important for future projects, so make sure you tracked those. So as things pop up and you're like, oh wow, I never really thought that would happen, keep track of those, because the next time you have a project, you don't want to say, oh well, I didn't think that would happen. You want to have a list of all those things. Every time you run a project, you're helping every future project out by tracking those lessons learned. That's a huge part of the project management body of knowledge, is just knowing what are the things that we learned that we can apply to future projects, because every project essentially is just an experiment. And we may get the deliverable we want, maybe it didn't have everything we needed in it, but we learned something so that next time we implement, we know what it is. Maybe we learned that this team member isn't very good at calculating schedule. So we're gonna apply that to the future. We're gonna work with them. Maybe we learned that our community room actually isn't the best space for this type of program. Great, we learned that. Now we can move on and try something else. That's not to say a different project wouldn't work there, but everything that you learn along the way, or you're like, I didn't think about that before, write it down, because that's going to be part of it, and go over it while you're closing. Your post-mortem, this is kind of the same thing. To get lessons learned, you talk about all the things that didn't go very well. You release the team. This is formally saying, team, this project is done. Go back to your normal responsibilities or start working on this next project. And then if it was a big deal, have a party or at least have some type of acknowledgement that it's over so people know that this project has closed out. You want to make sure that you close it, because if you don't, it's going to become kind of this hybrid project operation, and you don't have enough uh, capacity to start a bunch of projects and keep it going. You have capacity to start a project and then start another project and then start another project, but you can't start a project, it keeps living, and then you start another one that keeps living. You're going to run out of people power as well as budget eventually. So you want to make sure that you have that hard deadline. If you get nothing else out today, make sure you remember that if it's a project, close it out at the end of the project. And you made it to the end. That's all I had to say. What questions do people have, Jen? Anything fun or exciting?
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Sure. I know I threw a lot of information out there, so if anyone does have questions, feel free to let me know. You're also welcome to get in touch with me anytime if you do have project management specific questions.
Great, thank you. Let's give it a moment of people to write their questions, comments. We've got a lot of thank yous coming through. Lots of thank yous. I will say one of the things that I learned is I am the one that does scope creep.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know if I am a scope creeper or what the terminology is, but that is a weakness of mine. Oh, Anita has a question.
What's up, Anita?
Do you have any epic failures that you can share and lessons learned from them?
Sure. So I think let's go with so in library land. You want to make sure that when you have a project that you're going to start, it actually has something to do with with your mission or organization. And about 2 years ago, before I was the executive director, we ended up being approached about doing this project on substance abuse mapping within our community, which it was a great project idea. And I think it has the potential to help a lot of people. The problem is that our organization wasn't in touch with any of those types of organizations or people that were doing this work, but we ended up taking it on as the lead agency, and then I ended up being the project manager for it. So when you enter into a project and you know absolutely nothing about the field, and you're trying to manage a project with people who know a lot about the field, and they're not necessarily interested in helping you out with the project, it doesn't always work out the way that you want it to. So I would say that if you're going to do a project, make sure that it aligns with exactly what you're trying to do as an organization, because if you take something on that doesn't, this specific project, we ended up closing it out, but it wasn't that great, and we spent a bunch of resources on it it was great for the group that was working on it, so it was great for them. For us, it was difficult because there wasn't really a growth factor that we could use with it. So we completed the project, handed it off, and that was great for them. For us, we ended up having to take a step back because there wasn't really anything that we could do about it. So just make sure that if you are going to do a project, it's something that your organization is passionate about and that you actually have the capacity to do, and it's not pulling away from other projects that you are doing. And then I've had a bunch of other projects that have failed for a handful of reasons. I mean, there were some that that we ended up running out of money for it, which in that case you either have the choice of we end the project now and we give you the deliverable we have, or we just scrap the project and we say it's done. If you scrap the project, which is what we did in this case, make sure you still go out the closing the closing procedures and you go through those lessons learned. So the lesson learned for that one was make sure that your funding agency gives proof of funding before you actually start the project. Because if they just say, yeah, we'll contribute this, but then they don't actually have the money to contribute it, it will fall apart later on. So So make sure it's a mission of your organization, make sure that you actually have the money to do it, and make sure everybody who's on your project team is actually invested in the project before you carry it on. Those would be a few of them that are just off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
We have a few more questions. If
Great.
someone else wrote the scope and project, how do you come in to take it over?
So I would say that I would back it up a second. If somebody wanted me to be the project manager on this, I would insist that I was part of the scope development. Because if somebody else is writing the scope, they don't know my abilities, they don't know what I can do or what I can handle. So if I'm going to manage this, I need to be involved in those conversations. That's the ideal situation. If we were in a case where somebody else wrote the scope and then handed it to me and I wasn't involved in those conversations early on, I would ask as many questions as possible to get the full understanding of everything that they're looking for in this. And I would also want to know who's in charge of who has the authority to make changes to this scope, and what is the communication path if this is going to happen. Because what I don't want to happen is, okay, Ron, here's your scope, and I say, great, that's fine, I'll do it. And then I have no idea what the actual intent of the project is, and then things start to change because maybe the higher ups that wrote the scope originally changed stuff. So, and they're telling their people to work on it differently while I'm over here trying to manage it. So just making sure that you ask every question so you know what is expected of you, and also knowing who has the authority to make changes. Ideally, I would have that authority, and then I would run it by them. So my project team would have to come to me first, and then I would go to the client or the person who originally wrote that scope. But being involved in the scope development early on is a good idea. And talking about another failure, it reminded me that this happened to me once in library land, and it was a NILA president initiative, and I was asked to lead a task force on it. And I wasn't involved with the scope development, and I wasn't involved with picking the project team. So when we actually got together and started working on it, none of us really knew what we were supposed to do, and there wasn't any clarification that came out in any step of the way. So we ended up just doing the best we could and making something up. But I don't recommend that either, because the final deliverable wasn't what the person was asking for, but it was never clear what the person was asking for. So make sure you have a lot of that back and forth before you agree to take on that project.
Thank you. And actually, speaking of back and forth, there's a question here. Can you expand on communication management and what makes one successful at it? And then how do you stop wasting too much time communicating?
So I don't think you'll ever waste too much time communicating. I think you'll waste time in pointless meetings. But if it's something where you are scheduling a lot of meetings that don't have a clear agenda. I do a program on meeting management too, but if you don't have a clear agenda, which is the roadmap to your meeting, then I would say you're kind of wasting time communicating. I think the best way to make sure that you're not over communicating is in that communication plan, you ask people that are on your project team, that are the stakeholders, what are your expectations in terms of communication? Do you want an update on this weekly? Do you just want to be told when it's done? Like, what do you want exactly? And then the first part of your question was about effective communication, and that falls into that one that I skipped over a little bit, the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument. So everybody falls a little differently on how assertive they are versus how cooperative they are, and that drives their communication style in different areas. So I think the first one is just figure out what type of communicator you are. So do you have a high level of cooperativeness, but you're not really assertive? So you become this accommodating person that every time somebody says something to you, you're like, yeah, I'll do it, I'll take it on. You're like the yes man always. That's not, or woman, sorry. That's something that you may not want to be all the time. Or do you have a low level of cooperativeness, but you're very assertive, so you become this competing person where you always have to win? Understanding how you communicate and then tailoring that to your people. So when I communicate to my staff, I have 12 staff in the office, and I have 12 different communication styles for each one of them, because I know my assistant director, she loves to joke around, so we have a good time. Another staff member, she needs a lot of support in terms of making sure that she feels comfortable in the work she's doing. Another staff member that I have, she just wants the blunt, honest truth, like here's what it is, and I say it, and she's happy with that. So tailoring your communication to the person you're communicating to is going to help out a lot. And the best way to do that is just ask, how do you want to be communicated to? As a leader, as a project manager, it's your job to communicate effectively. So it takes work. It's not easy just to be a communicator. It took me a long time to understand everybody has a different communication style. I have to pick up on it and then change mine to help them understand with what I'm trying to do. That answered the question.
Thank you. That was great. And then we have another question. If you were to guess how many projects and libraries actually follow project management protocols and wisdom, my guess is that it's a very low number.
I would take your number and probably lower it even more. I agree. I think that on it, and I went to the so I'm just south of Rochester, and I went to the Rochester chapter of the Project Management Institute. So they have get-togethers and stuff like that, and I went there, and they said, what field are you in? I said, well, I'm the executive director of a library system. They're like, libraries? What does that have anything to do with project management? So I think the outside people don't think libraries have projects, but on the inside we don't treat them that way, and that's why. But literally every single thing that you do outside the scope of operations is a project. You want to buy Wi-Fi hotspots to put in your community. That's a project. You want to assign speakers on a race inequality issues. That's a project. You want to do some type of construction in your building. That's a project. Every single thing that you're doing outside of your normal operations, you are implementing a project. You should be following some type of project plan. And this is what I'm trying to get people to understand and realize, that you think about a project, you plan it, you do it, and then you close it out, and then you're on to the next thing. This is going to help so much with avoiding burnout from people who just get stuck in these long-term projects that don't go anywhere. It's going to help you better understand that sometimes projects are not successful, and that's okay. Shut it down. Move on to something else. Don't get locked into that. So it's just this idea that if your library can start pumping out projects, and not in the sense where you have to do a lot of them, but if you just think about it in a way where this is a finite thing that we're doing, the product may be indefinite, and that's okay. Like maybe you do something and then maybe you're creating a story walk or something like that. That's a project. The deliverable keeps going on, and that's great. But what you want to make sure is that you're sectioning off these things into project. It's going to help you as a leader. It's going to help your staff understand this better, and that's the best way to move forward. I very much believe that. And having people who understand not the intricacies of project management, but just understanding that we need to think about it, execute it, and then close it. Those are the main things that I want people to take away from this and understand.
That is great. And actually, there's another question here about how, is it possible to have like a simplified version of this, like for librarians to create a project management plan? How do we improve the number of people who are knowledgeable without people having to get their PMP?
Yeah, so I would start out with, so there's a couple of resources. First off, if you Google like project management books, don't read any of them if you want a light version of it, because they get into very dense stuff very quickly. I think that if you're not interested in a PMP but you're interested in running projects more effectively, in my resource list there's this book, and it's called Project Management Lite, and it's available in Overdrive. I know our collection has it, so maybe yours does too, but they actually have links to different types of like templates and stuff like that. So what I would say is you can customize those. And I would also say start very small. So let's say you have identified this project that you want to do. Maybe on this project, the only thing that you're going to do is you're going to write a project charter for it. And it's going to be well organized, and you have this charter and it just has the basic information, and then you go ahead and operate on it. That's great. And let's say that worked really well for you. So your next project, you bring somebody on and you say, well, this is how I do it. I create the project charter. This time we're going to have our closeout checklist too. So you can take like little pieces of this just to start applying them to the stuff that you're doing, and keep it simple, because if it gets too complicated, you're not going to do it. Trust me, I know. I don't always do all this stuff for every single project that I do, but if there's other people that are going to be involved, I do this stuff. But keep it simple, and even if you're not developing documentation, but you keep in the back of your mind, like, this is how we're going to do it. I'm thinking about it now. I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to close it. And here's what I'm actually going to do for closing. So maybe you do a project charter, maybe you just have your closeout checklist. So take it like one step at a time and do like little things, and then eventually you'll figure out what works for you, and that's okay. And as long as you recognize a project for a project, that's a good starting point.
Oh, and Anita says that they have a program checklist that they use for every program run at the library, and they're happy to share with anyone who wants to email them. So,
that sounds great.
Yeah,
good job.
Excellent. Thank you, Anita. So it's 11:15. Does anyone else have any last questions, comments? I mean, this was just so fantastic, and oh my gosh, I'm sitting here listening to the presentation. I'm running through like everything that I do every day, including like committee work. So it's just so relevant to everything.
Actually putting together a presentation for boards, and it's project management for committees, because libraries work like this, but I think a healthy committee structure on boards is a really good idea. Well, I mean, it's an essential idea, but then making sure that committees understand what they need to do in terms of a project. You have your policy committee, and if you apply a little bit of project management to your policy committee, you're going to be able to work much smoother through all the policy updates that you need to have than if you didn't. So things like that. So this stuff can be applied everywhere. You just have to think about the beginning, middle, and end closing of everything that you're doing. So yeah, totally, I agree.
All right, thank you. And Lori says, can we also do the team workshop and the meeting management and committee project management? This is super helpful.
I'm happy to talk to Jen about coming back and doing another one. A few years ago, I think it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago, I was actually at your system in person, and I did one on customer service. Grace had me come out and do it, but that was a few years ago now. So it's unfortunate I can't come out and visit again, but I'm happy to do online stuff. I do it for other systems too, and to me, it's just part of the thing that you do for other systems, because maybe at some point somebody from your system will do a presentation for us at Pioneer too. So this kind of information sharing, I think, is always good. So I'm happy to help out.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, great. I think with that, we'll say thank you so much. This was incredible. I greatly appreciate it. You're getting loads of thank yous in the chat.
Thanks for hanging out, everybody.
Yes, so we greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much, Ron, and to everyone. Thank you. Be on the lookout for an email with the online feedback form, as well as the link to this presentation.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Stay safe. No problem. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.